Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. My name is Bernard, and I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose. On behalf of the owners and of the staff, I would like to welcome all of you to your favorite bookstore for this evening's event. As you may know, Politics and Prose hosts like a number of events, uh, almost 100 every month. So if you're interested, if you want to know what they are, please visit our website for our virtual book events, partnered events, trips, and classes. Housekeeping before we start. Number one, please turn off or silence your cell phone so as not to disturb the proceedings. For the Q&A, please remember to step up to the microphone over here to make sure that we can not only hear the questions, but also that it is going to be recorded. For those of you who want to buy copies of the book, we are selling them out front at the registers. We will be doing a signing after the Q&A, so if you'd like to get your book signed, please line up again by the pillar over here. And lastly, once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs, lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. I am honored to introduce Antonia Hylton to all of you. Antonia is a Peabody and Emmy award winning journalist at NBC News, reporting on politics and civil rights, and the co host of the hit podcast Southlake. She graduated from Harvard University, where she received prizes for her investigative research on race, mass incarceration, and the history of psychiatry. Tonight, she will be talking about her book, Madness: Race and Insanity in a Jim Crow Asylum. In this insightful and necessary work of nonfiction, Antonia chronicles the 93-year-old history of Crownsville Hospital, one of the last segregated asylums with surviving records and a campus that still stands to this day in Anne Arundel County, Maryland. Through exhaustive research, she not only tells the legacy of this mental institution, but also contextualizes Crownsville within the larger legacy and history of American society's attitude towards race, mental health, and the intersection between the two. In their starred review of the book, Kirkus Reviews writes that Madness is a thoroughgoing, often shocking expose of segregation in the treatment or non treatment of mental illness, a strong contribution to the literature of both mental health care and civil rights. Antonia will be in conversation with Astead Herndon. Astead is a national politics reporter for the New York Times and a political analyst for CNN. He reports and hosts The Run Up, a political podcast from the New York Times, which was named one of the best podcasts of 2022 by The Economist. Previously, he was an integral part of the Times' political coverage in the 2018 midterm elections and the 2020 presidential elections. In 2020, he was named to the Forbes magazine's 30 Under 30 media list. His reporting on white grievance and former President Donald Trump was included among the New York Times package that was a finalist for the 2021 Pulitzer Prizes. Everyone, Antonia Hylton and Astead Herndon.
Hello. Thank you. Oh, it's so nice to be here. How's everyone doing? It's nice to be in this space, to be able to talk about this incredible work, and most importantly, to help you welcome Antonia Hylton, the author of Madness. Put it up again.
Thank you, Astead. And thank you to all of you. I am so excited to be here in DC. I have a sister in the crowd somewhere back there.
Yeah, we got the
And-
sister wave. Nice.
And there are some people who are in the book here too. And I'm very grateful to them for making the drive.
Awesome. I'm really excited to be here, partially because I think Madness is a unique work that a few things stand out. I think the biggest one is the scope of reporting that really went into it. And I really want to lay that out for folks. You said it was the culmination of 10 years of digging. And I wanted to know 10 years ago, how did you come to the realization that this is what you wanted to write? This is the story that you landed on?
Yeah, I was just a teenager. I was about 18, 19 on Harvard's campus, and I stumbled into a class called Madness in Medicine. And I was interested in the history of psychiatry, I think, because of my own family upbringing and a kind of personal longing or curiosity, I guess. I'm one of 7 kids. I come from a very big black family with roots in Georgia and Virginia and Detroit. And we are all very close, but the one topic a lot of elders in my family had trouble with was anything having to do with emotions, tough memories, or mental health. And for me and my siblings, it was often really frustrating to try to talk to people about stories we knew or family members who were missing. And we couldn't get answers from our own loved ones. And so I think when I was a teenager and I just had the opportunity for the first time in my life to study what I wanted to study, do stuff on my own, frankly, I realized that I could try to find myself, my own people in this space and get my own answers. And so, my first frustration was actually that often the history of psychiatry is taught virtually exclusively from the perspective of white Europeans and white Americans. And so I really had to dig at first. And so I found a few of these institutions, and Crownsville was one of the only ones that had surviving records and people who had been there. I mean, it closed in 2004 within all of our lifetimes. And so it presented this opportunity, and I was really just sucked into the work. I didn't know I was going to write a book as a teenager, but I knew that this was something really important, that it was going to stick with me for a long time. And so even after I graduated, I just kept building new relationships and kept reporting out the story because it was so personal. I
mean, is it that personal connection that had you land on Crownsville specifically? Because I get the general interest in kind of this issue coming from your family, but how did that story really jump out? Is it the records that were able to be found too?
I think it's a combination. It's that the ability to see yourselves reflected in a space that you thought you were excluded from. It was access to records. The state had destroyed purposely and accidentally a lot of the records, especially those preceding 1960, 1955. But there was a lot to still see. And then there were living people. And to me, that was actually really critical, that I wasn't just going to be taking doctors' writings about patients, their reflections on the population they served, their own letters back and forth, or politicians' perspectives on a certain institution, which is what you often see left behind, but that there were people who I could go to, I could gather their memories, record their voices, their facial expressions, and that's so important, particularly in a community that has been systematically excluded or mistreated by this institution, so that their voice is at the center of it, and that whatever I produced, whether that was at first just an academic project or it was finally a book, that it really reflected the community this institution was supposed to serve.
You mentioned that some of the people in the book are here. Do you want to point them out? Do you want to point out their significance to the book?
Are you comfortable with that? That's Faye Belt. For anyone who's read the book, you know that Faye plays a very big role in Crownsville. In some ways, Faye is Crownsville. She was raised on the hospital's property. Her mother was one of the very first black nurses to get the opportunity to work at this institution that previously only allowed white doctors and nurses to serve the black patients there. And so her mom's part of this initial group that integrates the space, and she follows in her mom's footsteps. And yeah, she deserves that credit. And in doing so, I tell the story of a friend of hers and a patient whose life she plays a role in saving. Stories like that were so important for me to find, because I think often when people learn about these spaces, they are taught or told a very one-note, stereotypical story, or a ghost story, a Goosebumps-like tale. And that's not what these institutions are. In the early decades, Crownsville is this very dreary place, renowned for racial violence and overcrowding and filth. But in the 50s and 60s, as people like the Belt family arrive, they do start to change the face of this institution, and you actually get this strange glimpse of something we don't have anymore, which is a mental health care system in which community is actually serving and taking care of community, in which the doctors look exactly like their patients. That is really rare right now. There's really almost nowhere that black people suffering with mental health challenges right now could go and know that their doctors and nurses wouldn't just look like them, but have gone to the same high school they went to, and shop at the same grocery store. And that starts to make a big difference.
And what was the that was a length of time for only that Crownsville that came and went. What was the period in relationship to Crownsville's length as a whole? Do you know what I'm saying? Because that only existed after they integrated initially. So can you give people a perspective of just how small that window of time really was?
Well, I'll take you first back a ways and then bring you back up forward. So Crownsville was founded in 1911 after decades of white doctors, politicians, thinkers debating with each other very openly in medical journals, in newspapers, at professional conferences, their theories of black people's bodies and minds. And a prevailing idea at the time was that emancipation in some ways had been a big mistake, that freedom was something black people couldn't handle, and that it was directly responsible for what they saw as rising insanity among black people. And so they create institutions like Crownsville to solve that problem. But in 1911, they realize they have this need, but they do not want to pay for it. And so they do something to black patients that they never do to any other type of patient, which is they force them to build the asylum from the ground up. And so in those early years, Crownsville is really like a plantation. There's this desire to go back to the good old days, to reconstruct the antebellum social structure as a form of therapy. Yes, yeah. I know you laugh, but this is something people truly wrote and published and debated at the time, and it informed their care well up until the late 40s and 50s, when those women and men start to get their feet in the door for the very first time, and they are then in this weird period where there's sort of this upper crust group of employees who are mostly white who've worked at the institution for a long time. There's new black employees who arrive, and they know their patients, but they don't have a lot of power. And then there is the patient at the very bottom of that totem pole. And so there is a period in the 40s and 50s and 60s of a real power struggle, actually, before you get to the community mental health care moment. And then in the 60s and 70s, frankly, a lot of those white people quit. They don't want to work here anymore. They do not want to be in an integrated workplace. And they say that openly. There are parts of the book where I write about the memories of black women, like going to the cafe to pick up their sandwich and hearing their white colleagues say, I wish Crownsville was the way it used to be. Yeah. And they finally get the opportunity to take over this institution. And so I'd say that period lasts from about like the 70s and the 80s. But the thing that's so frustrating for them at that moment, Astead, is that that's the same moment that the government's like, well, we don't really want to pay for this at all anymore. And we're going to start putting all our money in prisons and jails.
Yeah. Events that seem correlated, but also can be causal. You write in the book that it's a celebration of oral history, and you seem to take a point to defend oral history as just as valuable as, you know, the kind of traditional journalistic sources when you think about records and documents. Why was that also important to you, and how in that, and what were the gaps that you had to fill when it came to balancing how much to rely on written word or how much, or spoken word, and how much to rely on documents and sourcing, which also is a huge part of it?
Yeah. Well, first, I've always thought it was strange whenever I've seen historians or social scientists debate the value of oral history, because when somebody writes a letter or a memo, even in real time, all of their prejudices and beliefs and biases are there in the present moment and then put into the historical record. And so that's why I ask in that section, well, what source isn't infected with all of those things? And so the important thing for me was to see all of those sort of categories as complements to each other, not as in competition with each other. And then I think the other piece, right, is especially when you're talking about an institution run entirely by white people until almost 1950, and they are writing about black people who they've openly often admitted they do not see as fully human, who they think are so different and so strange that they need to be completely physically separated from their white neighbors.
To just take their word. That would be the opposite of journalism. That would be a complete disservice, and I would be writing a story that's not true. And so I pushed not only to find people who could share their living memories with me, but also to find records to integrate things like poetry and artwork from the patients in the book, so that you can get a sense of place, so that you can get a sense of their emotional and interior lives. And was so disturbing to me early on in this process was I sort of knew to be prepared for the fact that white superintendents of the hospital or doctors would write offensive things about the patients. But I think worse almost than some of the racist stuff they proactively said was actually how little interest they sometimes had in the lives of the patients. So they just wouldn't actually record anything about how they were doing.
If they were improving, what their lives and routines were like. When you look at their monthly hospital reports until the 50s and 60s, the hospital's primary concern, month after month, is how much are the patients producing. They keep very good records about the massive farm operation that the patients are running for no pay. They keep records about the patients that they have rented out to private businesses for no pay. Mm-hmm. They have records about how many rugs, how many baskets, the art shows and competitions that they send patients to for no pay, because many of the patients were highly skilled artisans who had worked in all kinds of communities in Maryland and beyond. And so that alone tells you a lot about the priorities and beliefs of the people running an institution, if they were much more interested in the rugs than they were in their patients' rehabilitation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, the other thing that sticks out is that Madness is not only a story about Crownsville itself, but you talk about your family and you talk about your own kind of loved one's journey through mental health. And in the author's note, you write that you felt a responsibility to be honest with the readers about what shaped and motivated you. And you actually spent 3 years interviewing your family in the process of reporting this book. Can you tell me about that experience, and why was it so important to you that this wasn't just a story of Crownsville, but a story that infused your own perspective?
Well,
because it's a brave choice. Like, you know, like, you, like, there could have been a version of it where that didn't happen. And so part of that, I think, is something that clearly is important. So why was that?
A few things. On the sort of journalistic side, thinking about my role as the journalist telling this story, we think of in our work of the times, the opportunities when we need to disclose something, when we just need to be honest with our reader about how we might have come to a story, or if we have a family connection to it, whether you are a business reporter, an entertainment reporter, or a civil rights reporter. And so I first felt like I had an obligation to tell you that I didn't come to this story out of nowhere. I came to this story because I come from a family that has a long history of mental trauma. I have family members who spent time in institutions not unlike Crownsville. My great-grandfather was sent to the segregated ward of a mental asylum in Michigan. And while I was writing the book, anyone who's read the introduction would see I had a family member, an immediate family member, dealing with a mental health crisis. And I was seeing what our current system was like up close, and living through the pain and challenge of trying to save and stabilize this person, while also reading the stories of so many people and families like mine more than a century ago. And I was deeply disturbed by the similarities. And so I think that emotional experience shaped the questions that I asked. It shaped the editorial decisions that I made. It shaped the stories that I chose to highlight, the things that hit the cutting room floor. And so I wanted to tell my reader that if you're going on this journey with me, you're going to learn about Crownsville through me, you should know that this is why I do this work, why I care about it. And I think you probably will feel and read on the page some of the emotional turmoil that I experienced while reporting on it. Mm-hmm. And then while also my family was trying to wrap their arms around and their resources around this person who was really struggling. And I think, to that point too, anyone in the room who's ever had a friend or a loved one who's experienced a serious psychiatric challenge or crisis and really struggled with their mental health, you realize you're faced with really, you have to make one of two choices. At some point, maybe it becomes too much and you see people make the decision to send that person somewhere or to give up on that person, to take a lot of time away from that person. But when you love people, that's a really terrible and difficult decision to make. And so your other option is to kind of meet that person, to go with that person where they are going. And if they are experiencing psychosis, as my loved one was, while writing Madness, in some ways I had to kind of enter it. I had to kind of submerge myself in it. because if you don't, you actually find that your family member, your loved one, or the person you're even reporting on and talking to, that they'll lose trust and faith in you. You won't have an open and honest dialogue. You can't tell people who are suffering in that way that, oh, the things you're afraid of aren't real. Don't worry about that. Get a good night's sleep. Pray about that on Sunday. Those things actually shut people down. And so you really have to ask them actually questions from a place of curiosity, like, how did that experience make you feel? Or that memory or thing that you saw, how did that affect you? And that's what I mean by kind of joining them in the experience that they're having. And that emotional experience absolutely shaped my reporting. And so I guess I wanted to bring you into that. I think the other piece is I've discovered a lot more people have had that experience than I previously had known. And so I wanted other people to know that if this is something you, like I have for a time, had a hard time talking about, you're not alone. I've been here too. There's another side of it. And I didn't want to ask you, the reader, to be braver or to think more creatively about our mental health care system if I wasn't going to try to do that with you or for you too.
I think that curiosity really comes through in it. But at the same time, so many journalists have experiences that are informing the options. I mean, they don't feel the need to kind of come and do that. You also then talked and reported with your family. What was that process like? Because even if you made that choice, that's also a thing I'm sure you had to negotiate and walk them through too. And how was that, now that it's out, like, how was that received?
Really well. And I swear it's not a cop-out. But it has been a journey. And so there were nerves on all sides. I was nervous. So I interview a lot of my family for the book, especially some of the elders in my family who were present for incidents that I wasn't alive for, but that have shaped my family and that I knew about growing up. And so, I would feel a little bit nervous before I called them. I would talk them through first what I was working on and the sort of heart and soul of the book. And I was very surprised. Most of the time, people were really excited about it. Even my loved one, who was dealing with these things in the current moment while I was writing it, they wanted to add their own reflections. They wanted to be interviewed. They didn't want to share their name. They weren't ready for that experience yet. But they wanted the world to know what it was like as a Black person to step inside these institutions or the current sort of clinics and emergency rooms that we have set up to as our current mental health care system now. And they wanted people to have to reckon with that. And so I think in a strange way, sort of in the period of the pandemic and the crisis coming to my family's door and our sort of our doorstep in the present day, pushed everybody to a place where they felt like they had no other path to go but to talk. And the book became a way, the reporting became a way for us to talk about some of our experiences or our pain in a way that was slightly abstract or sort of more of a community problem than just a personal and sort of isolating problem. And so I was surprised actually at how good it all felt and how comfortable everyone was. I have not had a single family member. I did have people saying like, hey, can you let me see chapter 6? but I did not have people saying, delete that, don't tell everybody, which I thought was very possible. I thought, okay, there's going to be some back and forth here. They wanted to see it. They didn't want to find out about it, at Politics and Prose. But they were, once they felt like they were wrapped into it and they had a say in it, it was actually very smooth sailing from there.
Awesome. I want to remind folks that in about 10-ish minutes, we're going to take some audience questions, and we want to make sure that we also give Antonia some time to read from the book as well. I'm going to keep going, though. You put 2 questions kind of at the heart of the book that I want to pose one to you. The first is, what's the difference between calling a Black patient incurable and deeming a Black population certain of criminal recidivism? And then the second was, to what extent can this legacy be at fault for a current reality in which many communities of color feel alienated from psychiatric services and our prisons and jails are full of people suffering from mental illness? I want to let's deal with the second one. How much do you
Big
think current?
questions.
Yeah. We'll slow it down. How much do you think current issues of over incarceration, and in particular, the disproportionate over incarceration of Black Americans, are connected to the racist legacy of mental health institutions that you lay out here?
Well, they're on the same genealogy. They're all in the same tree. And one of the things that the book explores in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond is how intimately tied together the asylum and the prison and jails are. I mean, literally, they share some of the same employees. So people are going back and forth working at one or the other. They share the same patient inmates who on one day are categorized as one thing and then the next week are another. And they also inspire each other and start to kind of steal each other's architecture and processes. And then you start to see the jail and prison system, the sort of carceral system, sort of eat up what's been left of mental health care. And one of the things that I try to help people kind of make sense of in that period is that there's all these very messy and concurrent trends going on in the late 20th century. One of them is that, broadly speaking, people are becoming more and more sympathetic toward patients because medication arrives. Politicians like JFK and others are pushing for community mental health care, get them back home, get them into vocational training, get them jobs, get them out. And they want to shutter these asylums. And so, there's all this media and film that is dealing with mental illness and trying to destigmatize it in some ways for the first time. And so we're seeing patients come out and people feel more sympathy. But there's also the civil rights movement going on. Black people are protesting and visibly angry in public in ways that many American institutions and thinkers weren't quite ready for in the moment. And there's this immediate and very harsh backlash and carceral response to that. And so at the very moment that there's more sympathy for a lot of white patients leaving asylums, there's actually less and less sympathy for Black Americans' concerns about this country. And those people their pain is sort of being pathologized and criminalized. And that culminates. There's this chapter called The Curious Case of the Elkton Three, where I look at 3 civil rights protesters who go to a restaurant in Elkton, Maryland, and they sit down. And they don't even mean to do a protest this day. They're just hungry.
Yeah, they're just living.
They're just living. And they sit down, and it turns out this is a whites-only place. They're asked to leave. They refuse to leave. The police show up and pick them up. And they are deemed insane for the crime of trying to eat at a white-owned restaurant. And they end up spending days in Crownsville on a hunger strike. And I think that story, when I first discovered it first, I was just in shock that I hadn't been taught this history, that no one has showed me the way that the mental health care system had aligned itself with and become embedded in the criminal justice system in that period. That I didn't know the story of these 3 people who fought this fight. But I think that this story tells you everything about the sort of trends and thinking of that time and the way in which Black Americans' very legitimate concerns about this country, how psychiatry and psychology actually collaborated in dismissing, disrespecting, and discrediting Black Americans' concerns, ideas, and beliefs. And so these institutions kind of get closer and closer until one sort of starts to eat up the other. And I kind of argue in the book, each era in this country builds upon the era that came right before it. And so when we live in a moment where in many communities in the United States, your local largest provider of mental health care services is a prison or jail, there are many people who cannot get access to medication or inpatient treatments that they need until they are arrested and get access to doctors who are working in these prisons and jails. I think that tells you a lot about how we got here, and you can't make sense of why it is this way without understanding all those concurrent shifts I just broke down.
The story of Crownsville was in the shadows for a long time. It was new to me. I think that the story makes clear, though, that it was not new to the people in Annapolis, not true for the Black community lives were shaped by it, by either having residents and family who were there or by working there. I know that you recently had a book event out there. I'm curious on like how that was specifically received among a community whose stories are so central to the book.
I think it was beautiful. It really was not. It was not a. There are some people who were there, right over there. It was not a normal book event. I'll tell you that. It was like church. There was a choir that sang beautiful selections. People were laughing and crying. There were a lot of elders in the community who came out who hadn't seen their friends in a long time, getting the opportunity to reconnect over food and drinks. It was much bigger than me or a book or me answering questions about the book, because many people in the audience knew more about this place than me. I mean, they lived it. And so it was really a celebration, I think, a moment for a lot of Black healthcare workers, frankly, to get their day in the sun, their moment in the spotlight after decades of work in this system, not a whole lot of credit, not a whole lot of support from the Maryland state government, and to kind of thank themselves, to pat themselves on the back, and to reflect. And there were patients there too, just getting the chance to celebrate how far their lives have come, that they overcame their experience there, that there was more to their story than just being at Crownsville. So I thought that was really powerful and beautiful too. And so, yeah, I showed up that day thinking I knew how that night was going to go, but it was just so much. They laughed because they know. They surprised me with some things. I mean, it was really special, but the flip side of that, right, is I think it tells you just how much a community has been yearning and trying to get people to listen to them. In fact, one doctor, a psychiatrist who worked at Crownsville for a long time named Dr. Brian Sims, told me at one point when I interviewed him, he was like, the story of Black people in Annapolis, a city that, for anyone here who's visited, is very beautiful, quaint. People think about the luxury boats out on the water and paddle boarding and cute historical tours of colonial buildings. That Annapolis has done this real great job at concealing a lot of its dirtiest secrets, at papering over the darkest parts of its history, and at not allowing its Black citizens to have a say in the story of the city and the broader, county Anne Arundel surrounding it. And I think for many of them, the whole reason they wanted to speak to me in the first place, why they answered the phone when a 19-year-old called them, was that they were looking to tell this story, and nobody had cared.
Yeah. It's also, of course, a testament to the work and the journalism that, like, that story was being yearned for, but also had to be told in a way that felt authentic to the community. I think that really comes through in the book. I mean, you've put a focus on the Black healthcare workers that changed Crownsville's face, that changed its actual practices. I guess it read to me also as a larger kind of resonance around representation, that in this structure that was not built to really support the kind of core rehabilitation process, that they were trying to make marginal or make the gains where they could. Did you read it as a kind of that? And what were the limits and kind of power that you learned about what they were able to do once Crownsville's kind of staff and employment did change faces?
Well, the staff is put into this sort of strange, that power dynamic that I was describing before. And even once there's this period in which the staff is, there are a whole lot of Black staff members at every level. Still much of the administration and control of the hospital is majority white. And so they're kind of bumping up against this ceiling, and representation really only can go so far. And what they are able to do, the way that they are able to affect outcomes, what's fascinating to me is that often it has very little to do with medication or a new technology arriving or a new training or practice. So much of it is their own individual decisions and the ways in which they try to just bring a little bit more humanity and love to work every day. Mm-hmm. None of this being particularly scientific or rocket science. I mean, they come in and they realize that there aren't enough clothing for patients in those early decades, so they start making, sewing, and bringing in their own supplies to the hospital without the support or recognition from the state. They start, male patients on one ward notoriously have pants that don't fit them, so they're falling down all day long, and they're constantly exposed and humiliated. And so women create these sort of makeshift belts or re-sew, and it's those actions, it's listening to them. I mean, in many cases, women start calling some of the relatives that they know that live in Baltimore or Annapolis and just saying, hey, did you know so-and-so is here? At one point, a nurse named Betty Hawkins tells me this unbelievable story about, within her first year on the job, finding out that a patient's brother didn't know for 27 years that his brother was in the institution, that he'd been lost for that long. And so her decision to make a phone call may sound very small, but it's that kind of thing that hadn't been happening for so long. And so they're able to make change, but change is this sort of individual, day-to-day grind, and they're not able to make this massive institutional shift that they might have dreamed or hoped they were going to make when they first got those jobs. And certainly once they start to see the writing on the wall and they start hearing rumors that the state wants to target Crownsville, close down Crownsville, the money is drying up, the budget's getting slashed every year.
Yeah, I gotta say, the state of Maryland does not come off great in here. The chronicness starts at the beginning and is a through line through the whole thing.
Yeah, I think it's very telling that at the end of the book, the department that was responsible, that still exists, that was responsible for all of Crownsville's operations, would not answer a single question.
Yeah.
Not even in writing. They would not send me a PR statement. I was expecting at least something like, oh, we acknowledge the history and, I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
We know the rest. We know the rest.
But they were like, oh, bye. No, please stop emailing us.
Mm-hmm.
So, Governor Wes Moore did speak with me, but he wasn't here for any of that. It'll be interesting. It's going to be very fascinating now for those of you who live near this site to see what happens in the next 3 to 5 years. The county now, they say that they're going to turn this into a memorial park, a massive community space that's supposed to be for healing. They want to give former parts of the asylum, some of the buildings and leftover spaces that still stand. They want to give them to mental health treatment spaces and nonprofits. They want to create housing for veterans and the elderly. They want to create public gardens that children can use to grow vegetables and flowers. But it'll be interesting to see if and how politics and bureaucracy seep into all of that. There are these big promises made to this community that hasn't been listened to for so long. And now they need to live up to those things after so many years of refusing to answer basic questions about them. And so I think we'll know very soon just how serious are they about it and how ready are people to actually live with and sit with this history.
Last question I have is, can you put Crownsville in context of the way the state's other mental health institutions were operating? How much did you, in your reporting, see the through lines of the kind of racist origins of Crownsville as unique in comparison to what I'm sure is a not-so-great history in the other mental health hospitals in the state?
Well, its origin story, for one, no other hospital in the state of Maryland, and in my research across the U.S., forced its patients to build it. And I should have said earlier, too, this was not patients carrying around some water, helping move sandbags. They were doing back-breaking work, pouring foundations, moving railways, clearing forests, while also running and building a highly productive, modern irrigated farm. And the photographs, the records, the state was actually very proud of this, so they wrote very openly about forcing patients, including 10 and 12-year-old boys, to be involved in such heavy production. And so the racist beliefs they have about the patients at the time are very clearly part of the foundation of the institution. And then what we see, too, is, asylums of every kind and serving every population had serious issues with abuse, violence, sexual violence out on the wards. And children's institutions accused of poor education. There's one called Rosewood in the state of Maryland that served white children for a very long time. But what I consistently found is whatever they were doing at those institutions was a whole lot worse in Crownsville's equivalent. So Crownsville has a children's and adolescents ward, and they are required to be running a school. For decades, they just choose not to. So Rosewood, the pure white institution, has a school. Crownsville doesn't. So the kids are living out on adult wards, living with patients who've been accused of being criminally insane, and they have nothing to do every day. No one's bringing them to a local public school. No one's giving them an education on the grounds. And state leaders are even pointing these things out, by the way, in the records. They're noting, oh, we still haven't set up a school. Oh, we got a notice about how we don't have a school. You know, that this was known, recognized as inappropriate and wrong at the time and now. And so Crownsville was different. At the same time, it's not unique because there are other institutions just like Crownsville that crop up all over the South. Very famous one called Central State in Virginia. And then in other locations, segregated wards of institutions, so sides of a single hospital that were treating their black patients very differently than they were their white patients. And so Crownsville is both this unique and strange story, and its founding is this almost sort of prophetic and like biblical story of these 12 faceless men. But it is also this very American and typical story in terms of the patterns and the similarities to what you see in institutions like it across the South at the time.
Yeah. We're going to open it up to audience questions in a second. I had asked Antonia to pick out a couple. One of the things I think really stuck out about the book was the collection of poems that she had from folks who are at Crownsville, and I think it creates a real grounding that I think really drives the emotion throughout the book. I asked Antonia to read a couple of them, and then we're going to turn it over to audience questions, and you can line up by this microphone here if you have one, which you better.
So I'll read a couple poems. This is one that a lot of people love. It's at the very beginning of chapter 12. And this is a poem by a Crownsville patient who went by the pseudonym Mr. New Unit, written in April of 1952. The New Unit was an area of the hospital at the time notorious for overcrowding and abuse of the many male patients who lived there. If you get sick against your will, they will bring you to Crownsville. But if you're a lucky so-and-so, it won't be long before you go. The doctors keep you until, and there you'll stay in Crownsville. And if they don't make up their mind, you'll stay there for a long, long time. But when it's time for you to go, you and everybody will know, and your mission you'll fulfill. Then you can leave Crownsville. But someday in the sweet by and by, you won't have to stay there until you die. Just trust in God, and you can depend. He will bring things to an end. Here's another poem that I really like. Let me find it. A second. Almost there, sorry.
I was trying to let the poem hang, and then now. No, I'm just kidding.
Here. I know where I can find it.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay, this one doesn't have a date, but it's from the 1960s. Spring Landscape by a patient named Phyllis. Spring is here. The warm, gentle breezes tell us that. But the most spectacular signs of spring come from the sky above and the earth, like the startled awareness one finds upon coming across the first clump of yellow crocuses and the ready-to-bloom daffodils. December, I will remember the spring when blossoms filled each bough. And who can ignore the spring sky in the morning with all its pinks and yellow lace at sunrise and the
Give it to your hand, like, as we're doing.
Thank you, Astead.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for all of your years of research and putting this book out. I did hear you speak on one of the morning shows last week, and I think I heard you say that there was someone who was involved in the community that does a tour or like a memorial tour of the area. Can you speak about that?
Sure. In April every year, I think this year it's going to be April 20th, there is a ceremony at this cemetery on Crownsville's historic land called Say My Name. And the community gathers there and they say the names of all of the patients who've been buried there. And it's this really important act of remembrance that's grown year after year because those patients were buried initially, for the most part, as numbers, not names. More than 1,700 of them, in fact, in a very sort of disorganized field. And it's when you walk in there, you walk up this hill, and it's actually really, it's stunningly beautiful and very peaceful. But because the stones are so small and sort of tilted down and buried, when you arrive, you don't even know that you're in a cemetery at first. And so a woman named Janice Hayes Williams and a team of volunteers connected to the community there. They hand out the names of patients that they've found in records, and they encourage people to share a bit of their stories, to walk around with each other, to pay their respects at graves. And the county is now promising to build a real memorial site there. So to create an art installation, they've hired a team of cadaver dogs that have come through to mark exactly where every body is buried. Work that could have been done 20 years ago when the hospital was shut down and hasn't been done until very recently. But there is really just this groundswell of support now and a recognition because not only do they finally have access to these names, but there are families in the Annapolis and Baltimore areas that have found and traced their history back to this institution, and they're looking for people and clues. And so it's a really lovely event where people come and you can see them kind of searching for their piece of their family history, and you can take part in that. Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much. Telling the stories of like invisible stories for people going through psychosis is so powerful. One of the things that struck me you said is that there was this brief period where patients were receiving help from people that look like them and help from the community. So taking a look at our mental health system now, what are the aspects from when there was that brief period where things were working that were communally centered that you think could be implemented now and that people that are allies can help kind of implement?
Well, I'll tell you what, there's a large community, or maybe large isn't the right word, a vibrant community of Black doctors, psychiatrists, nurses who've been trying to scream from the rooftops about what needs to change in our mental health care system, the very simple and not very costly steps they'd like to see this country take. So I can share their perspective with you. The first is that they believe that we need to have treatment centers that actually reflect the communities that they serve, and that would require supporting people going through medical school and through these very competitive and expensive programs. So creating opportunities that make it both affordable for them, but also not traumatizing, frankly, for them to go through these really exclusive degree programs. And so additional support and sort of the thinking about how you hire and make sure that your teams in any community in which you open these spaces actually reflect the kind of patient population they'll be working with, to give people additional training in cultural humility is the phrase I often hear them work or use in this work. And so that is not necessarily what we think of now in very hot topic, but in DEI training that you hear people talking about. This is something that humility is the emphasis. So this idea that you don't know everything and you can actually learn a lot from your patient. So listen more than you talk at them. And so it's not about making it a big deal that you don't look exactly like them or that you speak a different first language, but that you approach your work every day with humility and an acknowledgement that you're not always the expert and you don't know everything. They would really like to see some of our local and national leaders fight for a sort of reinvigorated and re-supported system, not for the recreation of these mammoth institutions, as we often hear people call, open back up the asylums. That's not necessarily what they're calling for, but they would like there to be larger, better funded centers with specialization. So they would like to see hospitals dedicated, say, to schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, the same way that you might send somebody to a pediatric oncology center, or there are experts in breast cancer who you wouldn't go to for another form of cancer. We should be thinking about the mental health crisis much in the way that we think about the cancer crisis. And they've been trying to get people to meet with them and to talk to them, but the thing that they say really keeps them from being able to get people in this city to listen to them is that the challenge is, so long as people don't talk about their mental health, so long as the stigma and the shame really lingers there, politicians do not see the mentally ill, frankly, as a valuable constituency, a group of people whom they need to serve. And so if we talk more about it and see all of ourselves as implicated in and deeply connected to this, and we all live with the knowledge that we are one life experience away from perhaps needing this care, then we would be a valuable constituency. Then we would be able to get them to take action. Of course.
Question.
Hi, my name's Bob, and thank you for your work. It really took my breath away when I first heard about your book, because my family moved to Annapolis in 1967 when I was 16, and then I spent the next 40 years living in Anne Arundel County, and I lived in Sherwood Forest for several years, which is right across the street from Crownsville State Hospital. During all of my time, living and making relationships in Anne Arundel County, this story never came up. And I was acquainted with a lot of folks who were connected in different ways through the community. So the real question is, what part of this systemic power structure in Anne Arundel County or the state of Maryland sort of kept everything, below the surface? Because, like I said, in just conversations with folks who are very embedded in the African American community in Annapolis and Anne Arundel County, this has never ever, come up in some of our, heartfelt conversations.
Well, I think there are a few. One of the things that a lot of Black residents in the area say to me is that there have been these aggressive campaigns in Annapolis and more broadly in the area around historic preservation, or local battles over what to fund or support locally, that have silenced Black voices and transformed previously vibrant Black communities and neighborhoods in Annapolis into, literally taken blocks that were 80 or 90% Black and turned them almost 100% white. And it's made it very hard then for Black families who've been pushed out, pushed further away, to get anyone to listen to their history, to get anyone to preserve their side of the story when these historical preservation fights have happened. So that's one element in which they feel like their own neighbors have just made the active choice to not hear them. And then I think, the other piece is that there's, for a while in the papers in the 50s and 60s, Crownsville is actually brought up all the time, but it's routinely attacked. It's just something I explore in one of the chapters by a lot of white community members who live nearby. They exaggerate and overemphasize the number of patient escapes. They paint many of the patients there as these very sexually aggressive Black men, and even when white patients from similar institutions do similar things, they describe their actions in very different terms. And so there's this sort of sensationalism surrounding Crownsville for a while. And it creates a lack of trust. So Black community members, Black patients stop speaking to those reporters. They stop cooperating with papers like the Baltimore Sun, frankly, because they just don't believe that Crownsville's going to get a fair shake. And then when Crownsville does get some kind of shake or discussion, often what they see then is local lawmakers or the county executives in the past coming up with solutions and ideas like, at one point they suggest building a wall around Crownsville, or forcing patients to get, some kind of like community permission card to even be able to leave to go visit a local store. And so, those kinds of things, they build up over time, and they kind of create these sort of two psychological experiences, two worlds in one county. And so I think that's why you find that so often there were people who just didn't know this was going on, because in a lot of ways they were just being purposely shielded from it.
Yeah, I should have also mentioned, as I said, my family came in 1967. As I got older and turned the pages back, Annapolis was still very much segregated. I mean, it had African American high school and elementary schools versus white. The churches were segregated, so it was a southern town.
Yeah.
It was a very southern town. Thank you.
Maryland never joined the Confederacy, but it had a lot of sympathy for it.
Ally. One of the things that came through that you just mentioned was also the reliance on the Black press that really filled a lot of those gaps.
Yeah.
It felt like an important piece in you being able to put together that history, because as you mentioned, there was good reason for those folks not to trust a lot of the traditional media sources.
Absolutely. That's one of my favorite parts of the book, was exploring the Baltimore Afro-Americans archives. They have an unbelievable archive, by the way, just for anyone who's interested in doing their own research. And their team is small, but they love to send you their resources and old photographs. And there are so many amazing Black Marylanders who worked for that paper, who fought on behalf of Crownsville patients, who published Crownsville patients' diaries and perspectives in the paper. There's one of my favorite parts of the book. I got access to a transcript of a conversation between a Black reporter named Elizabeth Phillips, talking to the state leader of mental health at the time in the 40s, battering this man, killing him, and getting him to really lay out his racist beliefs and his refusal to integrate the institution. Right. And, he admits on this call basically that he doesn't have any faith that Black people have any skill and ability to treat patients at all. And, this would be a complete hassle for him, and he's not interested.
Yeah.
But she gets this guy, and it's, really it was one of my favorite discoveries and sections, because she gets him good. So, yeah, you have that to look forward to.
Hi. Two things. One, thank you to you and your family for sharing your stories and starting off as someone who has an immediate family member, and as a brown person, sharing that and finding people to understand that is hard. So to open up your book and see that off the bat was something that I'm just really deeply grateful for.
Thank you.
Two, you started off the book talking about Polly Murray's father, and I just wanted to know why did you start there? Because it was interesting, because you didn't give it off like this is Polly Murray's father. You gave him color, you gave him character, you gave him life and all of those things. And so to get to that, I'm like, okay, and then get to, by the way, this is Polly Murray's father, one of the biggest civil rights advocates. Why did you start there? And I thought, of course she's a local Baltimore, but why start there?
A few reasons. I wanted to bring you into the institution and what it was like for patients in this early period. And there are so few accounts that the fact that William Murray's life story is rescued, it is preserved by Polly and her memory and her beautiful memoir, which everyone here should read at some point. It just, for me, immediately jumped out to me. I think also I was just so struck by the fact that this institution that had been just so under the surface and had received so little attention, that it had all of these critical ties to Black people as influential and amazing as someone as like Polly Murray. And whenever I talked to people one-on-one about the research as I was going along, they were always shocked that there was such a big, that someone like that could have a connection to Crownsville, or that Henrietta Lacks's daughter was at Crownsville. And so, I think it was really those two things, wanting to bring you into those early years, wanting to introduce you to a real person. And also, I think I'm making an argument in that early part of the book too, right? That part of what is bringing Black people to Crownsville in the first place is racial trauma and all that William Murray and the Murray family is subjected to. That you can't understand his breakdown and his family's decision to send him to a place like this without understanding first what was going on to a black family in Baltimore. This man is an educator at a time when people are writing in the paper and writing in medical and social science journals that black people don't deserve education, that they are inferior, that they'll never be able to learn. And he's showing up to work every day fighting against this. And he is, according to his own family, being burnt out and exhausted by it, and trying to raise his own kids to have self-worth and self-confidence in a world that keeps telling them they don't deserve any. He's exhausted by it. His wife dies in front of him. He's widowed and left alone. And, all of, and in these same years, Baltimore is passing some aggressive laws, like the first segregation ordinances that still, like the color lines that were created in the 1910s, still exist in many ways in cities like Annapolis and Baltimore. And so you need to know all of that. And I would argue it's incidents like that, it's patterns like that push black men like Pauli Murray's dad, like William Murray, to the brink, that bring them down to a place where they can go from being a celebrated educator to somebody whose life comes to a violent, terrible end at Crownsville. And I guess I see that story as like, if you can understand William Murray's story, you're going to understand and you're going to see a lot of what's about to happen in the book in a way.
This has to be our final question, but the good news is that Antonia will be signing books where you can not only buy one, get a book signed, but probably ask her the question directly. But yes. I think this is our final one.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for writing this book. I'm really excited to read it. I work for a disability civil rights organization, and when I tell people that, I often hear like, oh, you mean the civil rights of disabled people, not thinking of us as a greater arm of the civil rights movement, when in fact, you alluded to this earlier, ableism and racism are incredibly intertwined. I would love to hear any reflections you have from your research about the intersection of those two things and how you see ableism and racism's cruel dual sides.
Well, they're interconnected, just as you said, and I think what I see, especially in those early decades, is a country that's very comfortable discarding people and throwing them away. And race, class, and disability are all part of the equation that makes it okay for them to do that. And so, for Black Americans suffering with mental illness, they're sort of twice damned and dishonored, I write at one point in the book. First, they're Black, and then there are patients at Crownsville who have physical disabilities, who are who returned from fighting in wars in for the United States, and then don't denied access to health care, and then end up at a place like Crownsville. And then there are stories like William Murray's. And so I think you really can't understand one without understanding the other. It's some of the parts of the book that I think make that the most clear are sections about like Elsie Lax, because you see these sort of parallel tracks or stories that happen, right? So I think most people are now familiar with the story of Henrietta, Black woman from Baltimore. Her cervical cancer cells are taken from her by doctors at Johns Hopkins. They become this immortal and invaluable line that continues to be used by doctors all over the place today, and the family only recently was able to get some compensation from that. At the very moment that is happening to Henrietta and she's starting to suffer, she sends her daughter Elsie to Crownsville. Elsie is unable to speak. She has mostly communicates in what the family describes as sort of chirps and murmurs. She's described as an idiot in medical paperwork at that time, and as having epilepsy. And so she goes to Crownsville, and while her mother's cells are being taken and used by science, Elsie ends up being used by science too, and they subject her to this horrible, horrible study in which they take 100 children with epilepsy, drill into their skulls, pump their skulls full of helium to just get a look at their brains, and it leaves Elsie with these horribly disfigured and coughing up blood for the rest of her life until she dies at 15 there. And so I think race and disability in both of those stories, they're completely intertwined, and I think they still are. And disability often plays a role in decisions around criminality and the way in which Black children, I mean, I speak at one point in the book too to a famous black psychiatrist named Dr. Tammy Benton, who in her research has found that like when Black children who are suffering with emotional challenges or mental health challenges come to emergency rooms in the middle of a crisis, they are dismissed, discredited, and turned away, and less than 50% of the time they're able to get ongoing mental health care treatment, even if that's what they really deserve. And so you can't understand one without the other. Probably about to get cut off by Astead. But thank you. That is really such a crucial part of the heart of this book too.
Y'all, thank you so much for coming out tonight. Madness is a tremendous achievement.